Let's pursue a brief case study of Joan Baez's extraordinary life, which I identify as moral life, because Joan Baez, like Louisa May Alcott, is an independent woman who makes her own decisions, conducts her own person, and at the same time is committed to diverse areas of belonging, ranging from motherhood all the way to the global common good. It's important to note that Joan Baez reports intellectual activities which are important in her life, and also theological virtues. Like Martin Luther King, there are intellectual and theological elements to her moral life. Let's first read in the preface from 1987 her assertion that she has a good life. This is on page 13 of the preface. Joan Baez writing, "I have recorded these facts, first of all, because I have led an extraordinary life and want to tell people about it. Well, let's first inventory the ingredients of Joan Baez's extraordinary life, and then we'll conclude with some insights given in her autobiographies about human life. First, the ingredients. Let's divide the ingredients into three parts. Things she tells us about her person, things she tells us about her private life, what in Philosophy 225 I call my own life, and then finally, areas of shared life. First, Joan Baez's person. In both autobiographies, Joan Baez asserts that she has gifts, which are her most important features. And in the Roman Catholic tradition, a gift is something given by divine love. Let's hear Joan Baez talking about her gifts on page 11 of the preface. My greatest gift, given to me by forces which confound genetics, environment, race, or ambition, is a singing voice. My second greatest gift, without which I would be an entirely different person, with an entirely different story to tell, is a desire to share that voice. The desire to share her voice may be the virtue charity. Charity is that theological virtue empowering my love for God and also my love for my neighbor. And at several points in her autobiographies, Joan Baez does assert that she has a personal friendship with God. Also in Daybreak, Joan Baez asserts that she has an optimism for life which cannot be discouraged. And this is important for her as an activist and also a musician. And optimism is very likely a synonym for the theological virtue hope. So in addition to the gift of singing, Joan Baez possesses two theological virtues, charity and hope. Two cardinal virtues are an important part of her person. The first is courage. Courage would have to be an important virtue for a performer performing before thousands of people. And courage is an important virtue for a person committed to nonviolent protests. In Daybreak, there's an episode titled Window Seat, in which Joan Baez describes her courageous encounter with other passengers on an airline. Justice would be the second cardinal virtue possessed by Joan Baez. Justice is that habit empowering me to respect the rights of other persons. And Joan Baez tells us throughout her autobiographies that she is committed to defending the civil rights and the human rights of persons everywhere. Let's now consider Joan Baez's own life, lived independently of other persons. In the preface, Joan Baez tells us that she's always carried some specific principles to guide her decisions and pinpoint her goals. One principle is the commitment to pacifism. Joan Baez believes that all forms of organized armed violence must end. And Joan Baez, like Martin Luther King, is committed to nonviolent social change. In Daybreak, Joan Baez describes her commitment to meditation, a form of intellectual activity. Let's look at her talking about meditation on page 115. Joan Baez writing, "What we mean at the school when we say meditation is really very simple to explain and close to impossible to do. We mean to pay attention but not to concentrate, to be still and at the same time to let go." And then toward the bottom of that same page, "When all these thoughts crowd into your mind, as they will over and over and over, you are missing the minute. And by missing the minute, you are missing everything, because all you have is that minute." This idea recalls chapter 1 of Walden by Henry Thoreau. Henry Thoreau talks about his practice of wakefulness, the practice of simply being intellectually alert of the world around you. In Daybreak, toward the very end, Joan Baez describes her house in California. That's an important part of her private life. And this same house is where she lives today. And if you visit her YouTube channel, she shows some singing and guitar playing in the kitchen, which she describes in 1968. In her 1987 autobiography, Joan Baez tells us that she lives alone and that she's failed at married relationships. And of course, Joan Baez has many artistic accomplishments in music, in performance, and in painting. Some of these are collaborations, but many of them are presumably individual projects. Okay, let's now look at her shared life. Joan Baez is a mother, and Joan Baez maintained relationships with her family and friends throughout her life. In Daybreak, she talks about a friendship with the child of her neighbors, a girl maybe 4 years old. In Daybreak, Joan Baez describes the psychological trauma that she suffered as a young girl, moving from location to location and school to school. At some point, she began to participate in therapy, and in Daybreak, she describes a group therapy session, and this is presumably when she's now famous, and group therapy was an important way for her to talk with others and perhaps examine beliefs and assumptions like Socrates proposes. Joan Baez's musical career is distinguished by many collaborations. So collaboration is a big part of her career as a musician and performer. In the preface, Joan Baez informs us that she works through nonprofit organizations in the 1970s and the 1980s to pursue her goals of pacifism and human rights throughout the earth. So nonprofit organizations are a part of her shared life. In chapter 6 of the 1987 autobiography, Joan Baez tells us that in the 1960s and 1970s, she gave most of her earnings away to charity. And also in the preface, the author tells us that by the 1970s, her interest in human rights became global, and she's traveled throughout the world and performed in many locations, in many nations, in support of human rights. Okay, let's review some interesting life insights that are given in her autobiographies. First life insight is on page 77 of the Daybreak. Joan Baez writing, "To sing is to love and to affirm, to fly and soar, to coast into the hearts of the people who listen, to tell them that life is to live." She goes on to say more, but we're interested in life especially. Life is to live is a concise and poetic statement, and it's a valuable exercise to think about the meaning of such statements and the truth of such statements. When I hear the statement, life is to live, I understand that to mean, first of all, that life requires deliberate effort. It's not something to be taken for granted and allowed to go by passively. Instead, we require effort. And moreover, to live is an imperative of the verb. An imperative signifies that something is a priority. So when I read this statement, life is to live, I understand it to mean life is something that has to be made a priority. And that's something that she states in chapter 6 of the 1987 autobiography. Page 159, Joan Baez makes a statement I admire, which we began with the last V-lecture. This is on page 158. Joan Baez writing, "My life is like a crystal teardrop. There are snowflakes falling in their teardrop and little figures trudging in slow motion. If I were to look into the teardrop for the next million years, I might never figure out who the people are and what they are doing." She actually goes on to say that her reader is also a jewel or a gemstone. And those are, I believe, metaphors for what in philosophy we call natural dignity. The notion that we as persons are carry powers which make us sort of complex and always more than meets the eye. And here Joan Baez states that a life also has natural dignity in addition to the person. Finally, an insight on page 13 of the preface. Joan Baez writing, "It has taken me 2 years to trace these threads of my personal, political, spiritual, and musical lives, how they came together and how they fell apart, depending on the times and the circumstances." In this quote, our author proposes that a life is composed of threads and that we could distinguish different threads of a life. That's a valuable way of describing and perhaps analyzing a human life. Also in Daybreak, Joan Baez uses the phrase a lifeline. A lifeline for her is an opportunity or help that somebody provides so that a person can make a step forward in their life. So if we developed a full philosophy of human life, we might develop a terminology like the terminology that Joan Baez proposes. Life threads and lifelines.